Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus at Stanford University, and this is the fourth lecture in the Geocurrent series on the historical geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's topic is the main caffeine plant, coffee, or one of the main caffeine plants, the other being tea, which will be the subject of the next lecture. Caffeine is a very common substance in plants. Many different plants produce it. It seems to protect against herbivores, and it has other advantages for plants. It discourages germination of other seeds, encourages honeybees. It is also the most widely used psychoactive drug. It's largely unregulated and legal in almost all societies and socially acceptable in most cultures. Not all, however. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church, does not allow its practitioners to consume coffee. Interestingly, this comes from the word of wisdom from early Mormon history, which taught Mormons not to drink any kind of alcohol, but also not to drink hot drinks. Later on, that was interpreted to mean hot drinks with psychoactive substances such as caffeine. Now, there are other caffeine plants that are widely consumed besides coffee and tea. The best known would be the kola nut from West Africa. It's chewed. It's widely traded. It's been very important in West Africa for a long time. And it was used in some of the original cola drinks, which got the name cola from this plant. And it has high levels of caffeine. It's not traded much outside of West Africa because it doesn't preserve very well. It has to be consumed fresh. Another very important caffeine drink is yerba mate, a kind of holly, which is the most popular hot caffeine-containing beverage in southern South America, particularly Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and southern Brazil. If you're interested in the introductory lecture in this series, I have some maps of these substances, and I discuss them a little bit more. One thing I didn't talk about in the first lecture was a native North American caffeine plant, yaupon, another kind of holly, which grows wild in much of the southern part of southeastern United States. Its scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, is interesting. It comes from an observation by early European explorers that indigenous peoples would often drink large quantities of yaupon tea in ceremonies and then would vomit afterwards. It's really unclear where this comes from or what it means. Today there's a bit of a yaupon renaissance. A lot of gardeners in the southeast and elsewhere in the U.S. are planting it, partly because it's beneficial for wildlife. Its berries are eaten by a lot of birds, but also as a substitute for coffee or tea. The leaves are very rich in caffeine. It's less bitter than green tea, so it's not really commercialized, but certainly some people are drinking it. It's interesting to compare the coffee world and the tea world, if you will. This was a map I made that takes the top 16 coffee and tea drinking countries, coffee in shades of reddish brown and tea in green. Only one country is in both lists, which is the Netherlands, so it is colored with both. Interesting pattern, though. Coffee is, at least high levels of coffee consumption are concentrated in Europe. Interestingly, sort of a Central European band, but it's particularly the Nordic countries, Finland, and Scandinavian countries with very high levels of coffee consumption, whereas tea is a bit more widespread. But also quite a bit of coffee in the Americas. This is an older map that I made back in 2008, just of coffee consumption with high levels of coffee in shades of blue and lower levels in shades of red. So the dark red have really quite low coffee consumption. China, India, Iran are prominent. Many African countries, which is interesting because many African countries produce quite a bit of coffee, as we'll see later on. But high levels of consumption across northern Europe, Russia to Japan, and through most of the Americas, but interestingly not the Andean region, so fairly low in Peru and Bolivia, where coca tea is more popular, which we'll discuss, or in Paraguay, where yerba mate is quite popular. Coffee drinking before 1500, before the beginning of the early modern period, which historians generally date to right around 1500, was quite limited. The area of domestication was the southern highlands of Ethiopia, and by 1500 it had spread across the Red Sea into Yemen and into what is now Saudi Arabia, but really not beyond that. It was very much a regional drink. There's been a lot of work done on the genetics of coffee. There are many species in the genus Coffea. Most of them are in Africa. Most of them have caffeine. Coffea arabica is the best known species, and the one that was originally domesticated. And you could see here there's a yellow circle for the southern part of the highlands of Ethiopia. So again, quite limited. Coffee has a number of stories of its origin as a beverage for human consumption. I put in the slide Just So stories. That comes from a Rudyard Kipling collection of stories, which are fanciful, made-up stories for the origination of many biological features, essentially. And stories about the origin of coffee or tea, well, we'll see this in later lectures, or many other psychoactive substances have this kind of quality. So for coffee, as the illustration shows, an Ethiopian goat herder noticed very lively goats who were eating coffee berries. More of the stories have to do with Sufi mystics, Sufism being the mystical strain of Islam. So Sufis are people noted for their strenuous activities for seeking communion with God, which often involved all night long dancing and chanting sessions, and in those sessions falling asleep was always a risk. And so coffee was picked up, as was another drug called khat, which we'll talk about later on, which is mostly limited to Yemen and Ethiopia. So anyway, several of these stories have to do with Sufi mystics from Yemen who had gone across the Red Sea to the Ethiopian highlands and had somehow noticed birds eating coffee and being very lively, or were forced to eat coffee berries themselves out of deprivation or hunger. So I wouldn't take these stories to mean very much. It's interesting, there's a very large ethnic group, actually the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, the Oromo people. They have not historically been the most powerful ethnic group. They were not the founders of the main Ethiopian kingdoms historically, but they are very numerous and quite politically active these days. They number in the tens of millions. And the Oromo people seem to have the world's sort of oldest and most culturally embedded coffee culture. So not only are they drinking coffee and have been for a long time, but have made tea from coffee leaves and eaten dried coffee berry skins with milk, or roasted coffee beans with butter and salt, simmered coffee husks. So it's a wide array of different ways of consuming coffee. The Oromo are actually somewhat recent newcomers to the Ethiopian plateau. They moved in from the south. But to the south, there are many coffee species, and they may have had coffee using practices before they moved into Ethiopia. Anyway, it probably spread among the Oromo and then was picked up by neighboring groups. And around 1450, we don't know exactly when, it spread across the Red Sea to the highlands of Yemen. And there it was embraced by Sufi mystics who then facilitated its further spread. And some evidence that a lot of these Yemeni Sufis favored coffee over khat, which is another stimulant, psychoactive substance, a much stronger stimulant, which is often associated with certain social problems in Yemen today. I'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. So coffee was the milder of the two options of a stimulating beverage, or khat is not a beverage, it's chewed leaves, but a stimulating substance that would help one stay up to engage in dancing, chanting, and other mystical experience-inducing practices. So anyway, there are these close connections with the original spread of coffee and Sufism. It's kind of ignored in a number of histories. It's interesting, this little snippet of text I put in, people, scholars of Islam are trying to sort of recover this history and note the importance of coffee in the history of Sufism. We'll see later on cannabis originally spread through much of the Middle East and North Africa through Sufi networks as well. So after coffee is picked up by the Sufis, it starts to secularize, in other words, spread out of the specifically religious ritual context of Sufi practices into just everyday life in the Arabian Peninsula and began to move north. It caused some consternation. It was actually put on trial in Mecca in 1511. Several physicians testified that it's an intoxicating substance, and by most interpretations of the Quran, any kind of intoxicating substance is haram or forbidden in Islam or for Muslims. So it was banned for a while, but then the ban was revoked after an appeal to higher authorities in Cairo, who said that, no, it's not intoxicating. And it is really difficult to argue that coffee is intoxicating. It is psychoactive, no doubt about that, but intoxication is not what results. By the middle of the 1500s, it reaches Istanbul, or Constantinople, as it was actually still formally called at the time. But this was the capital and most important city of the Ottoman Empire. It was a very large city at the time, one of the largest in the world. And coffee houses started to appear by the late 16th century or 1500s. So these were places that would stay open at night, and they're sometimes considered to be this first sort of respectable public places for evening time socializing outside of the religious atmosphere, where people could come together from many different walks of life. Although I should say coffee was fairly expensive, so it would have been the more elite people purchase a cup or several cups of coffee and socialize and relax. By 1590, there were already some 600 coffee houses in the city, so it had become an institution. Now, it's important to note that many traditionalists were appalled and authorities were concerned. There were efforts to ban it, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. This was seen as an innovation, something that would be taking men outside of the family, or even more importantly, outside of religious activities, into this very secular space. I do want to note how important Istanbul was in, say, the year 1600. It had 700 to 800,000 people at a time when the largest city in Western Europe, Paris, had 400,000. London was maybe 200,000. Vienna, Amsterdam, only 50 to 60,000. And you can just see there on the map how large the Ottoman Empire was. It was one of the superpowers of the time. As I mentioned before, many Ottoman traditionalists did not like coffee, and there were several attempts to ban coffee, particularly under the Sultan Murad IV, Ottoman Sultan and Caliph, who was vehemently opposed to coffee, to cannabis, to other substances that had not been present in Islamic culture since the beginning of the religion. And there are many stories. We could see this from NPR, that the Sultan would wander around disguised at night and would decapitate people drinking coffee. I find that very hard to believe. The claim that he carried a 100-pound sword to do this, which beggars the imagination. But he certainly did enact very harsh laws against coffee. How effective were they? Well, obviously not entirely effective. They no doubt terrorized a lot of people, but coffee did not disappear. Turkey today is primarily a tea-drinking country, but Turkish coffee is still widely known, and very powerful way of, a very strong way of brewing coffee. Anyway, by the mid-1500s, coffee was being commercially cultivated in the highlands of Yemen, and it was shipped out internationally through the port of Mocha. Today, mocha means coffee mixed with chocolate, but originally it simply meant coffee. and it came from this port of origin. So coffee was shipped out of Mocha up the Red Sea to Egypt, into the Mediterranean, to Istanbul, and ultimately on to Europe. It was known in the 16th century in Europe, but it was a specialty. It was a medicinal drink. It was pretty much limited to apothecary shops, which we would today call druggist shops or pharmacies, I suppose. So it was very much a niche product. Yeah, you could find it there, but it was not popularly consumed. But due to European trade and diplomatic exchanges with the Ottoman Empire, a number of European elites became quite familiar with it. And in the mid-1600s, coffee houses started to spread into Western and Central Europe. And it's interesting, the first coffee houses that we know in a number of cities were right around at the same time, in the mid 1600s. Often it was Greek or Armenians who had been in the Ottoman Empire and had moved to Europe, who established a number of these coffee shops. A number of the initial ones sort of maintained a kind of a Turkish or quasi or faux Turkish atmosphere. That didn't last too long, and coffee houses were adapted to Western and Central European culture. London was a place where there was a particular coffee house boom in the late 1600s. So evidently there were some 82 coffee houses in London in 1668 and more than 2,000 by 1683. So really an explosive growth. And the initial period of growth was during what's known as the Puritan Commonwealth. The monarchy had been overthrown from 1649 to 1660. The Puritans won a war against the king. The king was beheaded, and you had this decade or so of Puritan rule. And during this period, the guilds weakened, and the guilds had a lot of control over merchandising in the city, and that gave a sort of an opening for this new form of business, the coffee house. But more important was that the Puritans really emphasized sobriety and looked down on alcohol consumption. So drinking in taverns had been one of the main evening entertainments. They didn't disappear, but with this new emphasis on sobriety, coffee was considered a sober drink, the opposite of alcohol. The opposite in many different ways, not only in its effect, but in terms of the main medical theory of the time, which emphasized the four so-called humors. I'll talk about that later on in this course. But the Puritans were also semi-egalitarian. I mean, egalitarian isn't really the right word, but they were against traditional aristocratic privileges. And the coffee house was a place of relative egalitarianism. It was an expensive drink at first, relatively expensive. So poor people were not in coffee houses. It was for the middle and upper classes. But within that milieu, it was egalitarian. There was no hierarchy of seating, as there often was. Aristocrats and gentry had no special privileges over merchants or other commoners. It's just the tables themselves being long common tables where people would sit together. And as in the Ottoman Empire, coffee houses became a place for evening gathering, for discussion, often intellectual discussion, not always, obviously, but also a place for serious business in many cases. Now, different coffee shops had different orientations, as we'll see in the next few slides. But the economic significance is incontrovertible. A lot of major economic institutions originated in coffee houses. The London Stock Exchange began in Jonathan's Coffee House, where businessmen gathered together, started to discuss business, started to exchange stocks that they had purchased in, say, the East India Company or some other large company that issued stocks, and so they could buy and sell. But political parties, insurance companies, even scientific symposia, many of these originated in particular coffee shops. It's also said by some that the custom of tipping originated here too. I'm not sure if that's correct. Here's one great example, Lloyd's Coffee House and the creation of a maritime insurance industry. So Lloyd's was a coffee house, and it catered to a particular clientele, sailors, merchants, and ship owners. Like I say, many coffee shops had this particular orientation, and Lloyd's was in the shipping world. And you could go there to get reliable shipping news, partly just by talking to other people, but news sheets started to be printed up, giving tables of ships' comings and goings. And this was the place, probably the best place to get that. And the clients discussed things of real interest to them, like maritime insurance. Shipping is a very risky business, so shipping was very important, as well as things like shipbroking, foreign trade in general. But Lloyd's evolved. Today, Lloyd's is in the insurance, and particularly the reinsurance business. It is not exactly an insurance company. It is to quote here, a partially mutualized marketplace in which multiple financial backers grouped in syndicates pool and spread risk. So it is has been a very successful and highly complicated industry born in a coffee shop. Some would even say that serious journalism began in a coffee shop, in what was known as Button's Coffee House. And I have in the slide here Joseph Addison, who along with Richard Steele is sometimes credited as the founder of serious journalism. Addison was a poet, highly educated. I believe he was a member of Parliament for a while. I would have to check that to be sure. But his journalism was not simply that of reporting news, but rather was based on serious intellectual discussions, but yet printed in a relatively cheap newspaper with a large circulation run, up to 3,000 copies or so a day, which at the time was a large print run. But newspapers would be often distributed in coffee shops. People could go there, read them, discuss them. And in Addison's weekly newspaper, submissions were actually placed in the lion's mouth in Button's Coffee House. And the illustration on the bottom right shows Martin Folkes, who was president of the Royal Society, the main scientific organization of the United Kingdom at this period, and Joseph Addison. Ironically, the location is now a Starbucks. So coffee houses could be educational institutions. They're sometimes been discussed as penny universities. You get a cup of coffee for a penny. Today, of course, that's nothing. At the time, a penny was, well, it wasn't a major expenditure, but it wasn't something that a poor person would spend just to get a cup of coffee. So it was, like I say, a middle class sort of thing. But it was places, a number of these were places of very serious intellectual discussion, and places where one could read serious journalism and engage in a lot of educational activities. Now, coffee houses varied. Some had sordid reputation. So one was known as Tom King's Coffee House, later Moll King's Coffee House, after Tom had passed on. At the daytime, it looked like a regular coffee shop, but at night it was a meeting place for prostitution, and became rather infamous. You can see here in this print from the time some disreputable activities going on. Coffee houses were, in general, a place of male socialization. Women were generally excluded. Now, obviously not in Tom King or Moll King's Coffee House, which was a different matter, but in respectable coffee houses, these were places for men. So women were often quite upset about this. Here we have here a women's petition against coffee, claiming that it's enfeebling for men and threatening women by excluding them from these spaces. So of course this would eventually change, but it shows that the coffee house culture was not universally celebrated at the time. Coffee by no means disappears from London or England in general, but it is supplanted by tea. By the late 18th century, tea becomes much more important. Tea houses, as we'll see later on, become a place of male and female socialization together, so that is significant. But by the late 1700s, the coffee house culture is declining rapidly. Some begin to serve alcohol and turn into simple taverns. Upscale coffee houses tend to become private clubs. Some become financial institutions like Lloyd's of London. And it's an interesting contrast with France, where coffee houses start serving food and become cafes, which we all know about today. You go to a cafe, yeah, you might get coffee, but it's mostly for food. Now, all of this coffee drinking, originally, I should say, just in the coffee houses, but as coffee houses decline, coffee becomes domesticated. People are brewing it at home, roasting the beans usually themselves, grinding them, and making their own. So coffee doesn't disappear by any means. It actually becomes cheaper. But yeah, European merchants were eager to buy coffee, and the only place to get it originally was in Mocha in Yemen. But supplies were limited and they were inconsistent. There were several times when the Ottoman Empire banned coffee exports. 1707, one year in particular, which caused a real problem for people engaged in the coffee business. So the Red Sea coffee shipments by the 1720s had reached 12,000 to 15,000 tons per year. That was effectively the entire world supply, according to Jonathan Morris, author of Coffee, A Global History. So anyway, with coffee becoming very important in Western Europe, both in coffee houses and outside of them, this is a challenge. And of course, there's going to be a response to that challenge. And what happens is European imperial companies, colonial companies, if we will, start to establish their own coffee plantations. So coffee escapes that Red Sea nexus where it comes from. The Dutch start growing coffee in Suriname in northern South America and in Java, which is an island now in Indonesia in Southeast Asia. The French start growing coffee in Haiti in the Caribbean. That becomes for a while the main center. The British are doing something of the same in Jamaica, another Caribbean country. And Portugal starts establishing coffee plantations in Brazil. It was interesting. It's a very rapid change. The Amsterdam Coffee Exchange in 1721, 90% of the coffee is still from Yemen. And 1726, supposedly 90% has come from Java in Indonesia, Dutch colony, colony of the Dutch East India Company. So massive plantations were established and within a short period of time come to dominate. Slave labor comes to dominate as well. In Indonesia, it wasn't slave labor, but something very similar. We'll see in the next slide. But in the Caribbean, it's from slave labor directly. In Haiti, in Jamaica, and other places in the Caribbean. Partly because of this movement of coffee into the colonial sphere with large plantations and coerced labor, coffee becomes much cheaper and starts to spread to the outside of this upper middle class and upper class milieu into working class culture. Coffee production in Haiti comes to an end with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. The enslaved people rise up, fight a very brutal war, are eventually successful. Haiti becomes independent, although not accepted by European countries of the United States. But the coffee plantations pretty much come to an end. And it's Asia that comes to the dominant position. Java, again, not the largest, but by far the most populated island of Indonesia, which is the center of the Dutch East India Company's empire in Southeast Asia. So much coffee produced there that Java becomes a synonym for coffee, as it still sometimes is today. The British didn't have access, obviously, to Java, which was a Dutch colony, but they had their own in what is now Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, under the rule of the British East India Company, and they established coffee plantations there. In both places, but particularly in Java, coffee was not produced through free labor. This is actually a scandalous topic in the history of the Dutch East Indies because it was so brutal. Basically, what the Dutch did in Java was to force the indigenous leaders, who in most places maintained a lot of their power, but under dominance of the Dutch East India Company. Anyway, the company coerced them to simply supply them with a fixed quantity of coffee. It was simply something that was demanded of them. And these local lords then required peasant households to provide coffee as part of their traditional, or we might say feudal obligations. So it wasn't a market-driven economy. It was one of extraction from local leaders who then extracted it from their peasant underlings, if you will. And this persisted for a long time. It was brought to widespread public attention in 1860, a famous book. It's not well known in the United States, Max Havelaar, but this book was translated into 34 languages. It inspired the first generation of Indonesian nationalists. But anyway, it was a novel about the titular character Max Havelaar, who was a colonial official, but finds out how corrupt this coffee system is. It's interesting, the subtitle is The Coffee Auctions of the Dutch Trading Company. So he tries to fight these corrupt colonial officials, and he denounces the entire system. He pleads for the King of the Netherlands, King William III, to put an end to it. And it did have a real effect. It's interesting. It's often compared to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published just a few years earlier. And the Dutch moved to what they call the ethical system, which was, well, not fully ethical, but a little better than what they had before. So coffee was hugely important in the history of the Dutch East India Company, and we could even say for the independence movement in the 20th century. The coffee plantations of Java and Sri Lanka and other places in Asia were essentially destroyed shortly thereafter, though. Starting around 1860, coffee leaf rust, sort of a fungal infestation of coffee leaves, spread. It originated, no surprise, in East Africa, where coffee was native to. It had been there all along. But when you get into these monocultural plantations in a new environment, plant pathogens, diseases, and pests can spread very quickly, and it pretty much wiped out the coffee plantations of Asia. Eventually, they were reestablished with more resistant strains and with various ways of managing the pests. But when it first hit, it was devastating. And so you get a movement to the Western Hemisphere. We can see this in a modern map. So this is a map showing the two main kinds of coffee, the more high quality Arabica and the lower quality Robusta. Robusta can grow in lowland environments. Arabica generally needs a more of a highland climate with more moderate conditions. A lot of Robusta is used for instant coffee or lower grades. Arabica, like I say, is the sort of the original and the higher quality. And this map shows Robusta only in Asia. That's not exactly true. There are certainly Arabica coffee farms in Vietnam and other countries, but it's mostly Robusta. And then a mixture in Africa and in the Americas. Brazil becomes, though, the main coffee producer in the late 1800s. First few years of the 20th century, it's 75% of global coffee production. So in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, they move on to other crops, well, particularly tea. That's certainly what happened to the coffee plantations. And Sri Lanka, they were replaced by tea plantations, much of Java as well. We'll talk about that later on. But by 1900, Brazil becomes the key coffee producer. Brazil had just ended slavery, one of the last countries to end the institution in 1888. So coffee had been cultivated as with enslaved labor. After 1888, though, coffee business is booming, plantations are spreading, a new source of labor is needed, and Brazil has a huge burst of European migration, particularly from Italy. In this graph, the green is Italian migration. Hundreds of thousands, a few million Italians move. The Germans, Poles, many other Europeans moved to Brazil at the same time. Not all of them went to work in the coffee industry, but a great many did. And it was centered in the city of Sao Paulo, which had been a sort of a secondary city or a large town, 30,000 inhabitants. Only in 1850, Rio de Janeiro was the Salvador, Recife, other cities on the coast were much larger. Sao Paulo was inland on a low plateau, moderately elevated plateau, I suppose I should say. But that was the good area for coffee production, and so Sao Paulo state becomes dominated by coffee production. Sao Paulo city takes advantage of this and becomes a huge city, up to 240,000 by 1900. Today, the city's over 12 million, and the metro area is some 22 million, one of the largest cities in the world. And that's really what Sao Paulo dates back to. But as so often happens, there was a crisis in Brazilian coffee production by around 1909, 1910. Overproduction, too much coffee planted. Price declines, and new competitors come in producing higher quality coffee. So Brazil doesn't lose its place. It's still the #1 coffee producer in the world, but it no longer dominates production. And as I said, some of the competitors were producing higher quality coffee. Colombia in particular. Colombian growers started to move into shade-grown coffee. You can see the contrast in these two photos here. Shade-grown coffee is usually not as productive, but it's higher quality. It's also vastly better for wildlife. You still have a tree canopy. Colombia also moved into selectively picking the berries at the optimal period of ripeness, a new processing method which produced higher quality coffee. And it wasn't just Colombia that got involved. The global coffee market was booming, so a number of other countries step in. Central America becomes another important coffee growing area. And I want to talk a little bit about the social ramifications, I should say socioeconomic ramifications of coffee and labor regimes in Central America. And in particular, I want to contrast country of Costa Rica with country of El Salvador and Guatemala as well, all of which became very important coffee producers. But in Costa Rica, the government had a policy of supporting smallholders, small-scale coffee production. It passed a homesteading law that allowed settlers to claim title in unoccupied areas in the central plateau of the country, which is very good for coffee production, and they became independent smallholders. El Salvador, on the other hand, used vagrancy laws to dispossess peasants of their property and establish huge coffee estates owned by oligarchs who then hired the dispossessed peasants to work on them. And this is one of the reasons why there is such a contrast in Central America between Costa Rica and, let's say, El Salvador and Guatemala. Costa Rica known for its political stability, low levels of violence, relatively high levels of social development, whereas El Salvador and Guatemala, much higher levels of violence, much lower levels of social development, although the contrast is not as great as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. It was really stark in that period of time. Costa Rica known for its democracy, high levels of freedom, El Salvador and Guatemala for autocracy, historically, many rebellions and social tensions that were just not found nearly to the same extent in Costa Rica. And many scholars have linked this to coffee growing regimes, property regimes. Who was controlling it? Who had the power? Coffee market continues to, global coffee market continues to expand, and other countries move in. So I'm jump way ahead to the 1990s when the government of Vietnam decided coffee is a good industry for us to enter. Vietnam has extensive highland plateau area. It often involved the dispossession of indigenous people who were supplanted by Vietnamese-speaking immigrants from the lowlands, so there are issues with this. But you can see in the graph just this huge surge of coffee production. A lot of this is low-quality Robusta, but Vietnam produces higher quality Arabica as well. And if we look at a map of global coffee production in 2022, the main coffee exporters are in brown, and we have circles to show metric tons per year. You can see Brazil is in top place, but Vietnam is number 2. Return to Indonesia, where it virtually disappeared, but it comes back, mostly with Robusta. And Colombia, interestingly, Ethiopia, the place of origination, is a pretty major coffee exporter as well. So you can see it's pretty much across the tropics. We see China, but that's going to be in the where it's produced is in the far south, in the more tropical region. Even some countries that don't produce a whole lot of coffee comparatively still have a situation where coffee is extremely important to their economy. So on the map here, I have a call out to Rwanda and Burundi, 2 very small countries in East Central Africa, small by area, but quite densely populated. And if we look at what's known as a tree map of their exports, you can see for Rwanda, coffee is, I don't know I couldn't find the date for this for either one, but coffee accounted at one time, fairly recently, 27% of exports, in tea another 22, and Burundi 23 and 16. So caffeine-dominated countries, if you will. And just to summarize some of what I've been talking about, if we just map the historical movements, we could start with a red line there going from Ethiopia across the Red Sea to Yemen, and then over across the Africa and the Atlantic to Haiti and Jamaica, and then all the way across Africa again to Java and Sri Lanka. I just put in Java, then to Brazil, then up to Colombia and Central America, and now number 2 back to Vietnam. So you can just see the sort of movements of main zone of coffee production, and one that really incorporates a lot of the tropical world. Now let's switch to the other side, coffee consumption. You can see this is a per capita consumption 2022. Finland, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden. You can really see this Northern European concentration. And the U.S. just manages to make this list, but it's at the bottom of this top, I don't know, what is that, 20 or so coffee consuming countries. By total amount, the U.S. is going to be much higher. This is per capita. This is something that is not really of long standing. U.S. was the top coffee consumer, both in absolute and I believe per capita terms, in the late 1800s. And coffee really started to decline relative to other drinks in other countries after World War II. The Civil War is often credited as a time when coffee consumption really took off in the United States. In the Union Army, soldiers were provided 36 pounds of coffee a year. Military leaders wanted soldiers to drink less alcohol, which has often been a problem. Coffee as a drink of sobriety and alertness, obviously far preferable than alcohol for a fighting force of men. I have here a photo and a title from an NPR article from a few years back. If war is hell, then coffee has offered U.S. soldiers some salvation. And there's a quote from one soldier, which I find quite striking. "We are reduced to quarter rations and no coffee," the private's letter continued, "and nobody can soldier without coffee." Now, coffee is an addictive drug. It's a very mild drug. It is not unhealthy. I'll talk about that at the end, but it does have mildly addictive properties. If you are used to drinking coffee, as I can attest from personal experience, and you don't get it, you tend to be irritable, have headaches, and so on for a while. So once you have the habit of coffee, you want to continue in general. Coffee culture spread after the Civil War into the American West. It became closely associated with cowboy culture. There's an entire cowboy coffee tradition. Quoting an article here, coffee was served as water with every meal for American cowboys. There would always be a pot boiling on the fire because that's how they liked it, piping hot and very strong. So it was a really, became culturally imbricated in cowboy culture, and not just cowboy culture, but other cultures of the American West. You can see this today. You drive through very, very small towns in the intermontane west of the United States, and you're going to see a lot of small espresso stands and the like, widely consumed. The late 1800s, there was a bit of a consumer revolution as the U.S. switched to branded and pre-roasted. Previously, people would buy coffee beans, which they would have to roast themselves and grind themselves. But Folgers of San Francisco pioneered a technique of roasting it their own, grinding it, putting them in sealed metal tins, and selling it nationally as a branded product. Others emulated it, and Folgers became a very profitable company. And like I say, as did other competitors, but a new way of drinking it. Coffee, as I mentioned before, though, coffee consumption in the U.S., gallons per person, continued to increase after 1900 and reached a high point around 1940, and then had plateaued and began a gradual decline. Tea supplanted it to some degree, but not that much. Tea is still much less consumed in the U.S., and most tea in the U.S., I believe, is iced tea. But what really replaced it was carbonated soft drinks, many of which are caffeinated. So if you look at total caffeine consumption, you get a different picture. There are many theories about why coffee declined. Part of it is being supplanted by carbonated drinks, although you can see there's quite a lag time in that. Some would say it's because Americans drink bad coffee. It's interesting. I just did a search of bad coffee in the U.S., and you get lots of articles like, it's true, Americans like to drink bad coffee. This has often been associated with coffee percolation, which was the main way of brewing coffee until the late 20th century, where you have a boiling pot, a little central stem, and steam comes up, and then water pours out multiple times through the grounds. And so many coffee connoisseurs say that produces really bad quality, although I have read that there are now upscale percolators which can produce more quality cup of coffee. Meanwhile, in the Nordic countries, you saw something quite different. There was a surge there in coffee drinking in the 1920s and 30s, which continued and made those the top coffee drinking countries of the world by a pretty substantial margin. This was associated in the 20s and 30s with a temperance movement. If you go back and look at the lecture I gave on alcohol, you can see that prohibition in the 19-teens and 20s was not just in the United States, but was also in some Nordic countries. There was certainly a prohibition movement. The Nordic Lutheran Church tended to be much less tolerant of alcohol than the German Lutheran tradition. Particularly, there were certain Lutheran revival movements in Norway, Denmark, and other countries that were very abstemious, very much against alcohol. And so coffee seen as a substitution. And Nordic countries also made a lot of legal efforts to reduce work strain, pro-labor laws, and one was to have legally instituted coffee breaks. There's another big change that comes in the 20th century when Italy develops a new a new way of producing coffee, of brewing coffee, and a new coffee culture, and that's espresso. It comes from the fact that a fresh cup is expressly made for each customer. But the big innovation was applying steam. You apply pressure to steam to speed up the extraction of caffeine and all the aromatic and flavorful substances out of the ground beans, so that you can do it quickly and you can get sort of more of the flavor. Interestingly, in 1911, Italy made a law that made it cheaper to drink coffee if you're standing up. And so, as this illustration shows, how not to get ripped off eating in Italy. Tip number 2, drink coffee standing up at the bar like the Italians do. So quite different from the traditional coffee house, quite different from modern coffee houses as well. But this is still true in much of Italy. You buy a very strong small cup of espresso, drink it very quickly. It's relatively cheap. But anyway, the Italians are continuing to innovate. 1948, new espresso machines with higher pressure to preserve more essential oils and hence flavor. This new ways of producing coffee, both espresso, but just new ways of roasting and brewing, spread from Europe to the United States after World War II. It's usually linked, this sort of coffee renaissance in the United States, to the West Coast, and actually particularly to San Francisco and Berkeley. So to quote from Jonathan Morris, Coffee, A Global History, coffee was an important ingredient in the 1960s American counterculture whose spiritual home lay in San Francisco. Hippies hung out at North Beach, and I should say North Beach was an Italian neighborhood at the time. Anyway, hippies hung out at North Beach espresso bars, run by Italian immigrants, and would purchase their beans from Alfred Pete's coffee store in Berkeley. Pete, a Dutchman, brewed his coffee considerably darker and stronger than a regular cup, despite the proprietor's that slide needs to be edited. His barely concealed disdain for many of his customers, Pete's became a mecca for those keen to experience European coffee. So it spread then to Seattle. Starbucks took this new coffee culture with espresso and various espresso drinks and darker roasts, different ways of preparing it, and nationalize it. So to quote Wikipedia, Pete taught his style of roasting beans to Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Broker, who, with his blessing, took the technique to Seattle and founded Starbucks. And today we have Starbucks all over the country. I have amended the map to show Great Plains and Great Basin Starbucks desert, where you're not going to find any Starbucks. Well, that's largely because the population is so low. Coffee culture continues to change in the United States. We have what is sometimes called third wave coffee or fourth wave coffee. Sort of a return to ritual, and I actually have a slide here for something literally called ritual coffee roasters, and they're going for higher quality beans, sometimes somewhat lighter roast. Many decided that Starbucks and Pete's were actually over roasting their beans, but looking for local sourcing and ethical purchasing and trying to have that as part of their marketing tradition. And just a general movement upscale into sort of more coffee connoisseurship, if you will. If you want to find the most expensive coffee in the world, it's Kopi Luwak, or Indonesian kind of coffee, up to $100 or $500 a pound. That was in 1910. I think the passion for this is kind of eased off, but Kopi Luwak or civet coffee is coffee beans that are eaten by civet cats. Civet cats are, well, they're not actually a cat. They're related to a mongoose, but a small semi-carnivorous animal who eat these. The coffee bean, the coffee fruit has a considerable store of carbohydrates, but then it has this central seed, and the civets do not digest that seed. So out of their scat, these seeds can be, coffee bean can be salvaged, and supposedly it produces a extremely high quality coffee, or some say. To quote the text on the bottom, within the coffee industry, it is widely regarded as a gimmick or novelty item. And it has sometimes been said there is a general consensus that it doesn't taste very good. I've never had it. Some people swear by it. I'm nearing the end now, but I just want to note that even to this day, different countries have very different coffee cultures. One of the most interesting is the Japanese kisaten. So Japan, it's not one of the most heavily coffee drinking countries in the world, but coffee is quite important in Japan. And the kisaten is a particular sort of institution. And it's interesting to compare coffee and tea. So, tea ceremonies are very important in Japan. They're very important for social bonding, but coffee is generally consumed more in solitude. Kisatens are noted as sort of peaceful urban retreats. I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and I will attest that on a very hot, humid day walking around a Japanese city, it is very restful to go to a air-conditioned kisaten. Often there's classical music playing, and enjoy pretty high-quality coffee. Different kisatens often have different themes. Most of them are just regular coffee shops, but some have classical music or manga or things like a cat kisaten for people who want feline companionship. So there are quite a number of these. Neko no kisaten, literally meaning cat kisaten. And there are many, many options. I found an interesting article on 10 of Tokyo's weirdest cafes and where to find them. So a ninja kisaten or an Alice in Wonderland kisaten. That tells you a lot about Japanese culture and its particularities. So finally, just to briefly conclude here, coffee production and consumption was obviously extremely important in early modern globalization. In 1500, coffee was very limited, and it spread explosively first in the Muslim world, then to Europe. Its production became highly global. South America, Central America, many parts of Asia, back to many parts of Africa, with a lot of countries relying very heavily on coffee for their exports. So coffee consumption, and I should say too, not just coffee, there was a real movement in the early modern world to the globalization of stimulants. So tea, another caffeine beverage, a somewhat similar story. And nicotine, tobacco, usually regarded as a stimulant, I'll lecture about that as well, had been limited to the Western Hemisphere and then explosively globalized. So there's been a lot of speculation about the connection between the early modern world, which is becoming a more interconnected, globalized, and commercialized world, early capitalism, if you will, and the spread of stimulating beverages, and in the case of tobacco, not beverages, but other forms of stimulants. So coffee is not to be downplayed. It has been and still is hugely important as an economic and cultural phenomenon. Final word I want to say, though, caffeine is the least concerning popular psychoactive substance. It's often dropped off the list. If you go back to the introductory lectures, where you have lists of the more dangerous psychoactive substances, they usually don't include caffeine because it definitely is psychoactive, but it's relatively mild. It's not something that people are becoming dangerously addicted to. Yeah, there's an addictive quality here, but it doesn't have the health danger. It doesn't have the sort of behavioral dangers associated with most addictive drugs. Its effects are mild. If you take too much, you get the jitters and you become very physiologically unpleasant, but you don't get the kind of intense high that you get with something like coca, what cocaine is produced from, or even khat. And then finally, the last slide I want to say, not only is it not concerning, it might even be beneficial. There's a lot of contending scientific studies out there with different conclusions to them. For a while, there was a lot of concern that coffee might be damaging to the human health. Today, most of the studies seem to show that it can have some problems, but it seems to have some benefits. Here's a Mayo Clinic recent article saying that coffee may offer some protection against Parkinson's, diabetes, liver disease, heart attacks, and even stroke. I have to say, as a coffee drinker, I am always happy to see these sort of articles. But I also think that it's important not to overdo it. I do know people who drink a lot of coffee who I think have some problems associated with it, sleep problems, jitters, and so on. But of all the psychoactive substances, popular psychoactive substances, caffeine, found primarily in coffee and tea, but in other substances, is the most benign. So in the next lecture, we'll look at the main competitor to tea, the second main caffeine plant, which would be tea. So I hope you will tune in for that lecture. Thank you.